All right, we're going to look at this question. Explain why chattel slavery becomes the main source of labor in the southern colonies by the 18th century. When we're looking at this question, we got to understand a few things. First of all, we have to understand terms. When you think of the idea of chattel slavery, what they're talking about is slaves being treated as property, as less than human without rights. Slaves being treated essentially as you would if you brought over pack animals. So why does chattel slavery, this very demeaning, dehumanizing view of slaves, become the main source of labor? So people working on the plantations in the southern colonies by the 18th century. So we have some terms here we've looked at. If we think about what this question is asking us to do, the skill that it's asking us to use is cause and effect. Maybe an element of this question is also looking at continuity and change, asking us why things changed. But I think the main thing, we're looking at the reasons why, what the factors that led to this change. So we're looking at cause and effect, and we'll look at main causes and long-term causes, short-term causes, and all the things that would have led from the use of free laborers to the idea of slaves being property, chattel slavery. So looking at this timeline down here, we could say that we have the year 1600 to the mid 1700s. So that's the 18th century, the 1700s, and we know Jamestown isn't started until 1600 or 1607. So we could put that on here. 1607 is right around here or so. But we know that there's no slaves introduced to Jamestown in 1607. The people that come to Jamestown are white settlers from England who are looking to make a quick profit and go home. They don't bring slaves. They don't even really bring laborers at that point. And we know the first few decades of Jamestown was miserable. Everyone died, 80% death rates. So there wasn't a whole lot of need for laborers when the people that were trying to own the land couldn't survive. The first slaves, we could look at some factors. 1619 is an important year. The first African slaves are introduced to Jamestown in 1619. There's about 20 slaves, people brought over on a Dutch boat, and they were sold off. Some of them, there was actually some free Africans that came to Jamestown also that actually ended up owning land and working as paid laborers. But there was the first slaves were introduced in 1619. So if we're going to graph the growth of slave population, we have to start around 1619. So that's a pivotal year in Jamestown for various reasons. That's also the first year that the new governor, Edward Sands, comes and introduces head rights. The House of Burgesses starts. And in 1619, the first African slaves are introduced. But those are very slow. If we're going to plot out how the growth of slavery were to increase over this time, there's a very slow growth of the slave populations in Jamestown all the way until the mid 1600s or a little bit past the mid 1600s. So there is an increase, but not a huge increase. So let me move that back a little bit. So why is there this slow increase? We can look at some factors here. So we're looking at some why slavery doesn't increase during this time period. We can say one thing would be that there is still very high mortality rates. So we think about the people that went to Jamestown were dying of malaria, conflicts with Native Americans, starvation, just the environment itself, very difficult to survive. And although the mortality rates started to decline as time went on, so it wasn't always 80%, still a lot of people died. So we know in these first years of people going here, they didn't rely on slaves, they relied on indentured servants. So indentured servants, you know from your readings, are people that were from England. They were English laborers who couldn't afford their passage to the New World, so they would find somebody that would pay their way, and then they would be indebted to them to provide labor for a period of time, 5 years, 7 years, something along those lines. So they weren't slaves, but they also weren't entirely free. They couldn't own land. They had to work under certain conditions, whatever their contract said, for the person that paid their way. This is part of, remember, the head rights system. Oops. So from 1619, to increase population and immigration to Jamestown, Edwin Sands introduces head rights, where if you pay your own way, you get 100 acres of land, and if you pay the way for an indentured servant, you get 50 more acres for each servant. So that was a way for landowners that could afford it to gain not just lots of land, but also people to work the land for them. So we have indentured servants in these first few years of people living there. So, and we could also put on here another reason why there's not a lot of slaves, why slavery didn't developed as a main institution, high cost of African slaves. Now, part of that during that time is because in the early 1600s, during the reign of the Stuarts before the English Civil War, the Portuguese had pretty much a monopoly on the slave trade. So we know that anytime you have a monopoly, you can charge really high rates for whatever you're selling. So the Portuguese, knowing that they were the only suppliers of slaves, could charge high costs of slaves. So you think about all these things combined: high mortality rates, the availability of indentured servants, and the high cost of slaves. Economically speaking, and it sounds terrible in the 21st century to talk about this as an economic venture, or the owning of other human beings, but this is how they looked at it then. It didn't make economic sense in this time frame to own slaves, because when you think about things like the high mortality rates, if you had to pay a lot of money for slaves, were more expensive than getting indentured servants, and their mortality rates were still 50 to 60%, then it didn't make sense to spend more money on a slave, because they might only live for 5 or 6 years anyway. You'd be better off paying the way for an indentured servant who's going to die in 5 or 6 years, because they were a lot less expensive. So early on during this time frame, economically speaking, it didn't make sense for people in Jamestown to own slaves. But as time went on, we have some other changes. We start seeing by mid 1600s, life expectancy increases. So in the Chesapeake, people start living longer. They start dying in less numbers. So the mortality rates drop. And we know that was the case in New England, but in the Chesapeake, it took until the mid 1600s, somewhere in this time frame, for the mortality rates to start to drop. And why is that? Because they became more accustomed to the environment. They had cleared or moved most of the Native Americans off the land they were living in, so less conflicts there. They started to adjust to some of the tropical diseases and treatments for things like malaria. More women start coming to Jamestown. We know in the Chesapeake, there was very few women, no women really in the beginning. And then by the 1600s, more women start coming to this area, so they're reproducing, and it creates a more stable lifestyle. So we can put up reasons here. So in 1600s, so the first slaves are introduced, but it doesn't really pick up. By the mid 1600s, we start seeing life expectancy increase. We also start to see a decrease in the cost of slaves. So right around this time, or after the English Civil War, which happened in the 1640s, when the Merry Monarch James II is reintroduced or brought back and restored to England, he starts to grant lots of favors to people that were loyal to the Stuart family. And in this time frame, they create the Royal African Company. So put that on here. An English company that had the right to trade African slaves to the English colonies. And then as time went on, even that monopoly was broken up, and there started to become multiple suppliers of slaves. Make that a little bit more clear. Started to be multiple suppliers of slaves, which drives the cost down. Now, if you had more than one slave company or slave trading company come to the New World to sell slaves, they had to be more competitive with prices, so that drives their prices down. So we had a factor here of decreasing the cost of slaves. The other big factor in here that you've read about is Bacon's Rebellion. And that's right around 1675, 1676. So on this chart, it would be right around this area. We start seeing a pretty big spike in the use of slaves over white indentured servants. If you think about why that is, from what you read about Bacon's Rebellion, the rebellion, although it was the catalyst for it, was trouble with Native Americans on the frontier. Really, the underlying problems in Bacon's Rebellion was the idea that there was inequality, or say inequity, in white society in the Chesapeake. There were people that lived on the coast that had the best land, had the best favor, had representation in the House of Burgesses, and there were people, white settlers living on the frontier, who were either new immigrants or recently freed indentured servants who were trying to now own land and become part of that upper class society. And Bacon's Rebellion showed that there was there's inequality or inequity between the upper class and the lower class within white society. These former indentured servants who wanted to be treated as equally with the landed gentry that lived on the East Coast wanted to they rose up in rebellion to try to fight for their rights, and people like the Governor William Barclay and other people that were in control saw that as a problem. So if we have all these poor whites coming to Jamestown as indentured servants, eventually they're going to, when they're free, expect land and rights, and they didn't want to give those to those people. They wanted to protect their own wealth and their own rights and their own power. So there's a shift after Bacon's Rebellion to slaves. It was much, now the mortality rates had gone down, so we have this box checked. We have the cost of slaves going down. Then we have this problem with Bacon's Rebellion. People start seeing it makes more sense around 1670s to use slaves instead of indentured servants. So we have this increase of slavery during this time. But the other part of this question is not just why slavery increases, but also why it has become more of the idea of chattel slavery. And we could put a couple other things in here. We could look at the idea of what we call the Barbados connection. And why this is important is because right around this time of the restoration of Charles II, the Merry Monarch, and he starts giving colonies away as proprietorships, as rewards to people who are loyal to him. The people that start the Carolinas had previously been proprietors owning land in the Caribbean, and particularly in Barbados. And in the Caribbean, the idea of slavery was far harsher than it was during most of this time in the American colonies. At least initially, way back in 1619, in these early years, they believed that Christians couldn't own other Christians as slaves. So if African Americans had converted to Christianity, that was a way out of slavery. In these early years, we don't have slavery codified as a racial system. It's codified as property ownership. The same way indentured servants were, but there wasn't as much of a racial connotation to it. Now, there was some racial connotation to it, but it wasn't as much as it will be later on. But when this harsh form of slavery gets imported from Barbados, we have more of the idea of the introduction of idea of chattel slavery, that they are less than human. They're definitely, in their eyes, they were inferior to white owners, and the idea that this can be codified. This could be more of a race-based system, that the color of one's skin determines that they should be more suited to be slaves than to be free. So this idea of the Barbados connection, the shift towards chattel slavery, this mentality of looking at slaves as property and as a race-based system where they're inferior just based on their race, takes hold in the late 1600s after Bacon's Rebellion, after the Carolinas get planted, and then the Deep South where labor is more intensive. And we know in the Carolinas, especially in South Carolina, in pretty much the whole colony, slaves outnumbered the whites living there. And later on, Georgia will be a similar thing. Not initially, ironically enough, Georgia started banning slavery, but then adopted it because of cash crops and the avarice that was gained by people wanting to get rich off of plantations. But we start seeing slavery then increase from this time on, and it doesn't quite plateau, but it not declines, but it stops increasing at such a great rate here, but then it has ups and downs. But as time goes on, and as the idea that the economy is based on slavery, right? When that starts back around here and people start seeing that slaves, once they own a slave, they own them for life and they're living longer because of greater life expectancy, and the cost of slaves has gone down, and the idea that they can justify in their mind that this is the way it's supposed to be because of this race-based system, right? They start looking at Africans as being intellectually and morally inferior to white people, that even if they're Christianized, they're best suited as slaves. Those mentalities start to kick in right around this time, and then they increase, and as it goes up over time, all the way through the Civil War, there becomes such a reliance upon slaves. We can put that last thing in here. I'll put it over here, number 6. The economic reliance on slavery. That even as time goes on and people start talking out against slavery in the 1800s and abolitionist groups form, and people start talking about how it's wrong, there's such a reliance on this in this time frame that people can't see their way clear from it. They start looking at it saying if we got rid of slavery, the whole Southern system would collapse and nobody's willing in the South is willing to do that, and really nobody in the North is willing to do that initially or either. It's not until again the decades leading up to the Civil War where people say this is an evil, an abomination, and it must be destroyed. So these are the reasons why we can look at in this time frame. The slavery increases and it shifts from the idea of labor to more the idea of chattel slavery. So if we were answering this, again, this is a cause and effect question. If we were going to write an essay about this and explain it, we would want to explain how some of these things are related to others, how some of these causes lead to certain effects, and how, in a sense, there's a cascading effect as causes. So, for instance, Bacon's Rebellion maybe doesn't have the impact it has here with this huge spike in the use of slavery if there wasn't a increase of life expectancy. If the cost of slaves hadn't gone down, Bacon's Rebellion maybe would have caused maybe still would have happened, and they might have the wealthy people and William Barclay might have put down the rebellion, but they may not have turned to slaves if the slaves still cost a lot of money or if life expectancy was still very low. So these things had to happen before these other things could have happened. And we look at things that, again, the idea of why chattel slavery develops. We could add maybe something else in here that I forgot to mention earlier. As a result of this, we start seeing slave codes written. And some of the first slave codes we see, slave codes are laws that would basically determine the status of slaves based on their race and based on their birth. And we start seeing those really first pop up in the late 1600s again, right? So we see laws involving slavery in the early 1600s when they're first introduced, but they weren't necessarily based on the color of one's skin, but that starts happening in the late 1600s. So for example, in the early 1600s, a slave woman who had a child didn't necessarily mean the child would be born a slave, but around here, that starts to be codified to protect the institution of slavery. That's partially because of 5 and 6, that slavery had become dehumanized after the Barbados connection and the idea of chattel slavery and the economic reliance on slavery. So as Southern planters became more and more dependent upon slaves, they needed the offspring to also be slaves so they could grow up and provide free labor they wouldn't have to buy again. So those slave codes start developing right around this time. Laws that would say things like a child's status is determined by the mother, not the father. At times in the South, white masters would have relations with female slaves and then have a child with them. And early on, that child might have been born free because the father was a free white person. But by the 1600s with slave codes, they start saying that a child born of an African mother is going to also be a slave. So they start to, in a sense, protect the idea of slavery with the laws related to that. So something we can take away from this, in addition to understanding why this happens, why slavery increases during this time with all these causes, and we have this spike leading up to the Civil War, is also when answering questions for cause and effect, looking at multiple causation, explaining main causes, secondary causes, maybe long-term and short-term causes, and how one thing can lead to another, right? Explaining that relationship. So again, explaining that Bacon's Rebellion might not have happened had life expectancy not increased or the cost of slaves not increased. So these are the kind of things we'll be looking for you to explain on an analytical level rather than just giving facts and describing what happened. So now that we've looked at the facts of the question and how to answer this, and again, we're looking at a cause and effect question, right? How do one cause lead to another? How do they result in the end result? Chattel slavery in the colonies by the 18th century. We could look at also how we would approach this as an essay, and we could break it up into paragraphs. Our first paragraph, we know that we have to provide contextualization. So we have to explain what led up to this question, what became, or what facts of history led up to this shift in slavery. So this is where we would probably talk about things like the 1619, the first slaves being introduced. We might talk about indentured servants in here. We might talk about head rights, just briefly to explain how they got to the point where they were. So indentured servants, maybe head rights. Only in 3 to 4 sentences we want to write contextualization. Then we have to have our thesis. Let's get rid of that. We have to have our thesis where we state the position we're going to have. We have to have a clear argument with main ideas that support it. So our thesis might say something along the lines of, by the 18th century, chattel slavery had developed in the southern colonies because of a drop in life expectancy, decrease in cost of slaves, the impact of Bacon's Rebellion, and a maybe over here, the dehumanizing mentality towards slavery. So in a sentence or two, we want to say that. We want to lay out exactly what we're going to talk about in all these supporting paragraphs. Think about when we read a thesis, I should be able to predict basically what your main ideas are going to be. And those will be the main topic sentences of each of these paragraphs. So then we might go on to write our first supporting paragraph and talk about some of the earlier changes that causes that started to shift towards chattel slavery. We might explain why life expectancy and mortality rates had dropped. We might explain in there, given details, why the decrease in the cost of slaves happened. That's where we'd fill in all those specific details. And remember, we can't just list facts, we have to explain what they mean. We have to explain why the decrease in cost of slaves led to more use of slavery over indentured servants, why life expectancy increases led to the more use of slaves over indentured servants. Our third supporting paragraph might be about Bacon's Rebellion. It's a pretty pivotal event, so that could fill up a whole paragraph about why. Now, again, not just explaining what happened in Bacon's Rebellion. We do want to explain briefly, but this is an essay about Bacon's Rebellion, so we don't want to go on forever. We might explain briefly the details of Bacon's Rebellion, but why did it cause a shift from white servants, indentured servants, to African slaves? Our fourth supporting paragraph might talk about the last few things that we looked at of why slavery became more dehumanized and a shift towards chattel slavery. So all these other factors are already in place, but this Barbados connection, the use of slaves as property and dehumanizing impact of it, the economic reliance, so making it easier for Southerners to look the other way and pretend that slaves aren't human. And maybe also in here we could maybe mention the slave codes that developed. So when we're answering a question, remember, we don't just want to give facts and describe what happened. We have to explain what it means. So we'd give the facts for all these things and describe what happened, but then explain in each of these paragraphs how it led to chattel slavery. And then our last paragraph, our fifth paragraph, our conclusion, we're going to connect all the dots. We're going to explain how this leads to this, leads to this, leads to that, leads to that. Right? So how we got from point A to point B and why all these things had an impact on things that followed it. So this is what they would be looking for in an AP essay. This analytical essay that explains how we got from one point to the other, answering that question.